Welcome to Philly Prime. I'm Dave Schratweiser. Two huge stories in Philadelphia this week. First, the Phillies go to the World Series, an incredible story. And the first and only debate with the U.S. Senate candidates from Pennsylvania, John Fetterman and Dr. Mehmet Oz. Joining me on the program, a guy who knows his way around both of these topics, FOX29 political analyst and baseball aficionado, Bruce Gordon. Bruce, welcome back to the show.
Always a pleasure, Dave. My two favorite things in life: politics and sports, specifically baseball. You can't beat this time of year for me.
No doubt about that. You're in heaven this week, I would assume. So let's talk about this. Tuesday night we had the first debate and only debate, and it was a wrestling match to get to it. But between John Fetterman and Mehmet Oz, much anticipated, watched by the whole country. Let me read you a couple of words from some headlines yesterday. Agonizing, heartbreaking, painful, tough to watch. Give me your read on that hour-long debate between the two, if you want to call it that.
Agreed.
Yeah.
I thought, frankly, it was a train wreck, literally from the jump. Among the first words out of John Fetterman's mouth were "good night, everyone," as opposed to "good evening." I mean, pretty obviously the kind of thing you say at the end of a session with someone in the evening and so forth. So right from there was that uh-oh moment, and it kind of went downhill from there. Look, everyone understands that John Fetterman had a pretty significant stroke just several days before the May primary. In the early days of that situation, there was little information coming out of the campaign. He ultimately spent several months off the campaign trail. And even in more recent months, when he's been out there, it has been under a somewhat controlled environment, meaning a speech given at a rally, but no impromptu questions with reporters afterward. Very few interviews other than those set up with some fairly strict guidelines in terms of the technology needed, a sort of a teleprompter of sorts where the question could be read by the lieutenant governor as he was hearing it. There are some issues post-stroke with how he processes information and gets that information out. And while I would never in a million years pretend to be a doctor or have any kind of medical expertise, there are some debates about this, whether this is cognitive per se, that is, you're not understanding what's happening, or something else entirely. And we are told it is not a cognitive issue per se. But the bottom line is what you heard that night was frequently garbled, mushy, unclear, and simply inarticulate, time and time again. And so it left a lot of people, I'm certain even those who went into that debate saying, I'm a pretty strong John Fetterman supporter, shaking their heads and wondering.
Yeah. Your thoughts on how Dr. Oz handled that part of the debate? I didn't even hear him bring it up. There was some in the media who accused him of bullying right after. I didn't see that. If you mean asking him questions about his positions and the facts that are on the table, he did do that, but I didn't see bullying or him repeatedly bringing up the topic of Mr. Fetterman's health.
No, I didn't either, and obviously that's by design. That is a dicey issue to be sure. You don't want to appear to be piling on to someone, especially once it's become clear during this debate that Fetterman was having some problems. I will say, around 45 minutes into the debate, there were a couple of occurrences, almost back to back, in which at one point Oz made a reference to, I don't think you're understanding what I'm saying, something along those lines, which under normal circumstances would be a completely innocent thing to say.
Right.
Maybe you didn't understand, Dave, that what I was trying to say was such and such. In this context, after 40 minutes of what we were hearing from Fetterman, it could have come across to people, and I'm sure it did to some people, that he was sort of trying to raise the issue again of, see, folks, this is what you're hearing. This guy doesn't understand what's going on. That was it, though. A couple of references like that. And frankly, I would imagine if Oz had a chance to take those specific wordings back, he might have, because by then it was abundantly clear Fetterman was having problems articulating his responses. Nothing needed to be said by Oz to further accentuate that issue.
Okay. Bruce, you mentioned issues. Let's talk about the issues. They fit plenty of them into the debate over an hour. They covered a whole range of topics, but let's start with fracking. That's an area where everybody thought both of these candidates were on opposite sides, but it turns out at the end of the conversation, it was not. Dr. Oz saying that he's in favor of energy here, and making this country independent on energy. But then when it came to Mr. Fetterman, we had a bit of a change from what we had heard earlier. So talk to me about that.
Well, actually, both of them, and the debate brought this out, both of them have expressed concerns about fracking in the past. Oz from a health standpoint, a health/environmental standpoint, and now, of course, is fully on board with it. Fetterman's comments were much more sort of black and white, and I think that's what led to the now infamous exchange there, in which he was presented with this idea that, hey, just a couple of years ago, you called this sort of a stain on Pennsylvania, this whole fracking business, and now you're fully in support of it. And Fetterman, frankly, just completely ignored, dismissed, never referenced the old position he had and simply stated that he supports fracking now. Did so in a very halting, very sort of odd sounding way, kind of repeated himself, and it was just not very articulately expressed. And it became one of those sound bites that gets played over and over again as an example of this is how John Fetterman sounded during the debate. And it's about a 15-second soundbite on this follow-up question of, well, wait a minute, you said X before, now you're saying Y. What's the story? And it was a very awkward answer from Fetterman that did not aid his cause.
And if you didn't see the debate, he said, "I do." Then he paused. He said, "I don't. I don't. I do stand there. That is my position on fracking. I do support fracking." And he looked somewhat confused while he was saying it. It was a follow-up question, which were supposedly also on the teleprompter in front of him, or the screen, the closed captioning screen. I'm not sure if it was, but he did seem to jump on it right away. So I think he understood it, but for some reason it did not come out the way he wanted.
I do think this, and if this, I'm trying to remember and I hope I'm remembering this correctly, but my understanding is, and I didn't realize this at the time, but I have seen reporting since the debate that indicated that the question was actually meant the way the moderator posed the question. It could have appeared that the follow-up was meant for Oz, not for Fetterman.
Right.
There was a huge delay there. Now, some of the reason for that delay, of course, is when you were reading the prompter that goes along with the question, that prompter may be a split second after the question. Obviously, that's no surprise. It's being kind of done in real time there, I'm imagining. So there's a little bit of a delay there, but there was an added delay, and it's not clear whether Fetterman thought the question was posed to him or to Oz. In any event, the upshot was him very clearly stating that he supports fracking. But there's no question that he said just a couple of years ago he did not support fracking. And again, by the time you got to that answer at the end, you understood that he was for fracking. But the way he said it, the way he stated it, was frankly somewhat of a garbled mess. And that soundbite is going to get played over and over again.
Yeah, some of the networks played two specific interviews in which he said he was opposed to fracking, and also showed a photo of him signing a pledge to not back fracking. So in the past, before this debate, it was pretty clear where he stood. Now it's somewhat muddled, I would say, at this point, and that has people nervous.
And in fairness, the comments that Dr. Oz had made on this subject, again, were health/environmentally based. And the idea of his earlier comments was essentially that we should really watch out for fracking until and unless we can get some legitimate studies that show it is absolutely safe. I am frankly unaware of any such studies that have said, hey, fracking is wonderful and safe for all, and yet now he's fully supportive. So he has his own bit of flip-flopping there as well. But again, not quite as black and white as Fetterman was.
Yeah, and they'll probably come back with that if he makes a big deal out of that soundbite we talked about, the I do, I don't soundbite. I'm sure there'll be a return ad situation here. Let's talk about crime. Dr. Oz repeatedly tried to bring up Mr. Fetterman's stance on crime, his position as president of the parole board, where he's supposedly voted to release 225 or 215 inmates, several murderers, get them out on parole. Talked about a third of the prison population being reduced, things like that. I didn't think John Fetterman actually answered that question in any kind of real substance during the debate. But what was your thoughts on whether Dr. Oz scored some points in that area, at least?
Well, it's interesting. That is what, we all understand that the lieutenant governor, almost like being vice president of the United States, there's the old joke that, there are really very few actual duties to that job, mostly ceremonial. In the case of the lieutenant governor, it's a similar scenario. One of the specific tasks that he has is heading up the Board of Pardons. And in that role, you can do some wonderful work in terms of getting an early release for those who you believe have been truly, can be reintegrated into the society and so forth, and they've been rehabilitated. But it is always fraught with danger because every single solitary person who you say, yes, Freddie here should be let out. If Freddie reoffends, it's coming right back on you. You're the one who let him out, and now he reoffends. The challenge in particular for Fetterman is that he was not always in lockstep with Josh Shapiro, who also is involved in that process. And so he was more, if you will, lenient with regard to some of these pardons than was Shapiro. So it's not like he can simply say, well, look, all of us were on the same page when we let Charlie out. And yes, it's a terrible tragedy that Charlie then murdered someone 2 years later, but we were all in lockstep. His position was somewhat more, if you will, lenient than some others on the board of pardons. And so it is absolutely an Achilles heel for anybody in that position, short of simply being in that role and saying no to everyone. If you say no to absolutely everyone in that position, then you'll never get second guessed because none of them will reoffend on your say-so, so to speak, or on your watch. That's not really, realistic. But yes, it's an absolute area where he has some vulnerability. No two ways about it.
And you've seen the ad. Actually, there's an ad with Shapiro in the ad saying he did the right thing and Fetterman did the wrong thing. That's been played about the last week or so repeatedly. So they're contrasting two Democrats against each other as well for that purpose, I'm sure, that you just made.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, look, crime is obviously a big issue. An even bigger issue for Republican voters than for Democratic voters, but it's a big issue for lots of folks, especially in the suburbs. Suburbanites often get their view of crime in the city through the local media, local television in particular, which has a tendency of over-covering some of these crime statistics and some of these the day-to-day violent crime and so forth. And so the Republicans, Oz in particular, needs to do well in, say, the Philadelphia suburbs, for example. He's been here in person a lot, in this region a lot, for obvious reasons. If he can do at least reasonably well in the suburbs, then he's got a very good chance to capture the state. He's going to lose big in the city of Philadelphia, but he's going to do well in a lot of other rural areas around the state. So the real battleground becomes suburban areas like the collar counties around Philadelphia, and crime is a big issue for those folks.
Yeah, Bucks, Delco, Montgomery counties, making a lot of appearances in all those counties, on that particular point. He also asked Mr. Fetterman why he hasn't apologized to the African-American man who he apparently stopped while he was mayor of Braddock with a shotgun. And it turned out the guy was out for a jog. And Dr. Oz tried to make points on the fact that according to Dr. Oz, he's never apologized to that man. He has said publicly and on TV that he made a mistake in that confrontation. But Dr. Oz repeatedly kept saying, why haven't you apologized? Why haven't you apologized?
Yeah, and in all these cases, frankly, Oz was able, because he is a skilled performer on television, and I don't say that in a pejorative way. Look, the guy hosted his own television program for a number of years, so he is a skilled communicator, no two ways about it. And so I do think on issues like that and several others, frankly, he was able to more effectively press Fetterman than Fetterman was able to go after Oz on many areas of vulnerability for Oz. I think that Fetterman, again, because of this challenge that he clearly had articulating answers and comments, was fairly ineffective in going after Oz for some of the vulnerabilities that he has. And we mentioned the TV host. There is plenty of hay to be made with some of the bizarre medical treatments and supplements and products that Oz pushed on his TV show for many years.
Right.
Here's the miracle weight loss pill, or eat 12 grapefruits a day and wash it down with avocado juice, and you'll drop pounds miraculously. But I don't think Fetterman just had it in him to be able to articulate those kind of attack lines and force Fetterman to really go after a real answer. The moderators at one point asked Oz about that.
Yes.
And he kind of sidestepped it, as he did many questions. And look, when you're a skilled communicator, and
You know
this
that.
is not specific to Oz, a good candidate, I ask you question A, you give me the answer to question Q, which is what you wanted to talk about in the first place.
Right.
And we saw a lot of that from Oz throughout the debate. Again, a skilled communicator. Early on, they asked Oz about the idea of, getting the budget, getting the government's budget, the federal budget in line. And he went to the age-old, we're going to get rid of fraud and abuse.
Yes, $4 billion worth of fraud, 4% fraud in the budget. Yeah.
Right. And we're going to get rid of it like every
and use it to fund everything else, right?
Right. And the answer there, of course, is the benefit of that answer is, of course, it's utter nonsense. Everyone's been saying they're going to get rid of fraud and abuse for the last 10,000 years, going back to Adam and Eve, for crying out loud. And no one ever does it. There's a reason why there's fraud, why there's waste, and that's because people aren't all perfect. And there's a reason why there's fraud, and that's because people aren't always honest. And that happens in a mom and pop business, a major corporation, and the government. So what it allows you to do is to say, I'm going to do that. And because I do that, I get rid of fraud and waste. I don't have to actually cut any programs. Well, that's the easy way out. Of course, you have to cut programs or raise taxes or some combination to balance the budget. But you don't want to make the tough choices. So you say you'll get rid of waste and fraud and so forth. So you had things like that throughout the evening as well. But again, when you're a skilled communicator, you can get away with it a lot more than Fetterman, as he tried to dance around some of these issues.
Yeah, Fetterman made a couple of points he continued to drive home. One was that Dr. Oz was going to cut Social Security and Medicare. He repeatedly tried to get that in, including in Dr. Oz's closing statement, which I thought was rude, but he tried to do it. Yeah. And secondly, he has harped on this, and it's been kind of the key ad for him, that Oz is an outsider, that he has 9 homes or mansions in New Jersey, and he just moved to Pennsylvania to run for the U.S. Senate, and even tried to say that some of the profits from his shows and the products and or that he's endorsed went to buy those mansions, in kind of a nice little backdoor move, I thought, by him to bring up the you're an outsider, you just moved here to run for the Senate, the carpetbagger issue kind of thing. I thought he did do that well, and that has been a centerpiece of what he's been talking about in this campaign.
And ironically, that is information, and those are lines of attack, really, that go well back into the Republican primary. Let's remember that Oz, who is by all accounts, a skillful communicator, a smart guy, and a very successful guy, but when he was in the Republican primary, took quite a beating from the other candidates on issues like, you're not actually from Pennsylvania. You've lived in North Jersey for all these years, and you have homes around the country, but you're not really a Pennsylvanian. You have tenuous links to the state at best. You have flip-flopped on some issues like gun control and abortion and so forth. So you're not a real conservative. So he's been hammered with some of these issues in the past. And I think that issue of not being a real Pennsylvanian was one of the few attack lines that Fetterman got out that I think probably resonates. And it clearly resonated with Republican voters in the primary. You'll recall that while Fetterman, for better or worse, Fetterman coasted to victory in the Democratic primary, and in the Republican primary, it was a nail biter, with roughly 2/3 of the Republican primary voters voting for someone other than Mehmet Oz. So he still had a lot of work to do to bring all of his Republican potential votes on board. It looks like that's happening more and more as this race has clearly gotten much tighter, but he had some work to do. Oz had some work to do to get those other Republicans on board with his candidacy.
Yeah, last poll I saw, the difference was about 2% in favor of Fetterman within the margin of error there. So let's call it a dead heat for now. Let's see how that changes as a result of this debate. I saw
more
some
often
headlines.
than not.
Yeah,
more often than not, Dave, I would say that these debates, while we in the media look for every little point to jump on and say, well, this could have been a game changer, that could have been a game changer. The reality is these things don't often move the needle all that much.
Right.
This, I think, could be different. I'll be fascinated to see, especially where independents, moderate voters, those in that middle quarter or so, middle 15% of the electorate who could be swayed one way or the other, if they watched that debate or they saw coverage of that debate, what did they think of Fetterman's performance, and are they a little more nervous about him as a potential U.S. senator after seeing the debate? We'll see.
And Oz has to have that independent vote because clearly Democrats outnumber Republicans in this state. of
Right.
Pennsylvania, and he has to win that vote. So that's kind of key. 3 headlines I saw last night. New York Times says the debate raises anxieties among the Democrats. The NBC said Dems on edge. CNN said it was tough to watch. Those kind of things out there do make people nervous, and I'm sure it's about those independent voters, very important independent voters. That's what's making them nervous, I think, at this point. How are they going to see this? Yeah.
Yeah. And look, this is the most watched race in the country for a variety of reasons. Obviously, right now, we have a 50-50 U.S. Senate, 50 Democrats, 50 Republicans. The Democrats control the chamber, if you will, by virtue of the fact that that the vice president can break the tie in a tie vote. But there are battles of roughly 1/3 of the Senate is up every 2 years, up for reelection. And this is, for the Democrats, viewed as a key opportunity to pick up a state. Obviously, they're retiring Pat Toomey as a Republican. This is a pickup for Democrats if Fetterman wins. And they know they're vulnerable in some other states like Georgia, maybe New Mexico and Nevada. There are other places where Democrats are the incumbent and feel like they could wind up losing a seat. So Pennsylvania becomes massively important in that regard because there are so few races that are truly competitive and that could actually represent a flip from one party to the other.
Okay, let's talk about the issue that I saw at least one reporter claim that it took center stage at the debate. I don't agree with that at all. I think what took center stage was Mr. Fetterman's performance. Having said that, abortion got a lot of traction in this debate. Dr. Oz made a couple of comments. Mr. Fetterman made pretty clear where he stands. Talk to us about what was said during the debate and how you think that kind of worked out at the end.
Well, as you mentioned, Fetterman was quite clear that he supports Roe v. Wade. That is the actual constitutional right for a woman to have an abortion. Dr. Oz, though he used to be somewhat in favor of abortion rights, his position has changed over the years. He was a big supporter of the Supreme Court decision that came out back several months ago that stripped away that constitutional right and essentially sent it back to the states in an effort to say that it is no longer that he believes the federal government shouldn't have any role in it. The way he phrased it, I think, was fairly unfortunate for him. What I think he was trying to say was each state should have a right to make this decision, not the federal government. What he said was local elected officials. In other words, this is a decision should be made between a woman, her doctor, and local elected officials, which on its face is shocking to many women, those especially obviously who believe they should have a right to an abortion. The idea that a local elected official should have any say in what's going on inside their body is horrifying to a lot of these women. I suspect what he meant, again, wasn't local per se, not the mayor of my town gets to decide whether I have a right to have an abortion or not, but rather state officials. Either way, again, this was not a flip-flop in his position. Everyone understood where Oz stood on abortion, so I don't think this is some big game changer, but it did, I think, remind those voters, especially women voters, who feel abortion is a huge issue in this race. It reminded them where Oz stands on this issue. And for those women, the idea of having someone say, well, I don't think the federal government should be involved in telling you whether you can or can't have an abortion. I believe instead the state government should have that right. That's a distinction without a difference, right?
Yeah.
Your congressman's not going to tell you can't have an abortion. It's going to be your state senator who tells you you can't have an abortion. Well, what's the difference? You're still not able to have an abortion. So I think there was some something to work with there. Fetterman's camp had a campaign ad about 15 minutes after the debate ended on that subject, on that line. But again, it simply serves as a reminder as to where Oz is on this issue, where Fetterman is on the issue, and if that's an important issue for you as a voter, it's a reminder of where the parties stand. It does not represent some kind of massive flip-flop or horrible gaffe in the sense that, you know, he said this, but now he says that. It's just a reminder of an issue that Democrats clearly believe will help them in November.
And the Oz campaign made no effort yesterday to walk that line back. I think they were questioned about it several times by reporters apparently and asked to kind of walk it back. I did see one of the networks last night do something interesting. I think the Fetterman campaign brought out a doctor yesterday to talk about Dr. Oz's comments. on abortion. And one of the reporters actually asked during that news conference, "You've presented us with a doctor to talk about, Dr. Oz's position on this, but you haven't presented your own doctor to talk about your own health, other than a letter we got from your doctor saying you were fit to hold office." It was an interesting challenge. I think it was I think it was on ABC News last night, and it was an interesting kind of question there.
It's a vulnerability. There's no question about it. And especially, I mean, look, if Fetterman had performed particularly well and seemed clear and sharp and articulate in the answers he was giving and in the attack lines that he was coming up with, I don't think this would have been an issue. But it did not take long for a viewer to figure out that there is still some level of impairment there. Remember, we're 5+ months out from the stroke back in early to mid-May, and presumably there's been some improvement. Presumably that improvement in his condition would continue. Now we're 3 months or so away from him taking office if he were to win this race. So would he be somewhat better off in 3 months than he is today? Let's say, for example, that he would be. That's still something that a voter has to take into consideration, because what they heard in that debate had to be troubling to them. And so the idea that you're going to talk about medical issues, but you're not going to come completely clean about your own medical situation, that's worrisome for folks. And there's no question that, especially in the early days, in the immediate time period post-stroke, that they were not particularly candid. They were not open about what was going on. And the answer that they gave is the answer that political campaigns often give. Well, things were changing in real time, and we didn't want to give false information, so we wanted to make sure we had all the facts and so forth. And more often than not, that's frankly something of just a dodge, so that you don't have to say anything at all. We don't always get to wait till we have every single answer before we say anything at all on an issue. Sometimes people want information. They understand it may change, but they want the information now, not later.
Yeah, and I did see a lot of sentiment last night, folks saying that they wanted John Fetterman to improve. They wanted John Fetterman to get the care that he needs to return to himself, if that's possible, after a stroke fully. Then there were some who were saying they were concerned if he's the 51st vote in the Senate on a key issue, or issues like what we saw on the debate stage gonna pop up again. There were others who were kind of tried to play both sides of the fence there, be nice to Fetterman, but at the same time question what's he going to do when he's under stress on the Senate floor in an instantaneous situation where he has to read, understand, and vote on a bill. His camp, by the way, says he did great, that he's fit for office. They revisited that. They said they thought he did well, that he took it to Oz in the debate. Let's be fair. That's what they said. That's what they're saying now. But there's all kinds of opinions all over the landscape here, and it really matters, in 12 days at the polls, what those independent voters, and does he lose any Democratic voters based on his performance?
Yeah, look, and the Fetterman camp did what folks often do, almost always do before debates, and that is they lowered expectations. You talk up the debating skills of your opponent, you talk down your own situation, so that as long as you don't walk out on stage and burst into flames, you can say that we met the expectation bar, we cleared the expectation bar. But there's no question that was a problematic performance. Look, I think there's a bigger issue here as well, Dave, and that is that when you talk about those independent voters, or let's say Democratic voters in this case, it's not unreasonable for someone to look at a Democratic voter and say, you watched John Fetterman in that debate, and you still want to look at me with a straight face and tell me he is ready to be a United States Senator. Look, we hope he gets better. We hope he makes a full recovery. No one wishes him ill by any means. The question is he ready to be a United States Senator in 2 or 3 months based on what you saw in that debate? And the question that some of those folks were probably saying to themselves, the answer they're giving, those Democratic voters, quietly to themselves and among their friends, maybe we have some real questions, but when push comes to shove, we know how he's going to vote on the issues that are important to us. There's no question he has the cognitive ability to take votes, to make votes and so forth. So as long as he can vote the way we want him to vote on the major issues, we'll put up with some of these other problems that are out there. Much as Democrats look at Republican voters in a state like, say, Georgia, and they say to those Republican voters, you mean to tell me you can listen to Herschel Walker speak for 5 minutes and tell me he's ready for the United States Senate? And some of those Republican voters undoubtedly are quietly saying to themselves, yeah, he's not the sharpest knife in the drawer by any stretch of the imagination, but we know how he'll vote on important issues that we care about. That's all we really need. He's on our team. It's all party politics, and in this age of incredible partisan divide, if you're going to vote the way I want you to vote, I'll put up with a lot of other stuff. That's the mindset.
Some of the print media even saying that Democrats were quietly saying, why'd you put him out there? We could have kept him under for the last 2 weeks here of the campaign and not run into this problem we now have. And, it gets a little uncomfortable when you see that kind of situation, So, they were complaining that, you should not have agreed to a debate, because several Democratic candidates have not agreed to debate their Republican opponents in several states. They could have taken that stance, but they didn't. They stepped to the plate here.
Frankly, you don't have to go any farther than Pennsylvania. I mean, in Pennsylvania, it was essentially in the governor's race. It was essentially Doug Mastriano, the Republican, who basically put so many restrictions on whom he would take questions from, that they wound up with no debate at all on the gubernatorial race there. So could you have done that? Yeah, I suppose, but you were going to take some significant heat over that. No question about it. The other issue that I think hasn't really been discussed much, but I think it's not such a bizarre idea. If there was some understanding that Fetterman's performance was going to be this problematic, you have to wonder at some point whether somebody couldn't have or shouldn't have stepped in and said some weeks ago, perhaps a couple of months ago, do we really want to continue with John Fetterman as our candidate, or do we need to switch horses? In midstream, to use the old cliche, but do we want to switch horses and choose a Connor Lamb, a Val Arkush, the two other main candidates, one of the two other main candidates in that primary, purely on the basis of the fact that John Fetterman needs to continue recovering medically and perhaps is not up to this? If this was the best performance that we could see 5.5 months out from that stroke, then you have to wonder whether they wouldn't have been wise, party officials, it wouldn't have been wise to say, we have to make a change. Because again, no one wishes John Fetterman ill from a medical standpoint, but this was, as I say, a very problematic performance.
Let me put you on the spot a little bit here. I mean, we're 12 days out. A lot can happen in 12 days. A lot of ads will be run in the next 12 days. The TV stations are making millions on all this, including our former employer, FOX29. Well, you're still an employee somewhat, but let me ask you, how do you see this going at this point, or is it too close to call?
I genuinely, I know it sounds like a dodge. It is. I think it is.
Well, that's okay. It's okay here. We're 12 days out.
Absolutely. It is absolutely too close to call, and a lot of it's going to depend on who does the better job of getting their supporters out. I think at this point, it's fairly clear that both sides have enough votes. If they got all of their supporters out to the polls, either side could win. The question then becomes, who actually does that? Who actually gets their people to the polls? I think what we've seen in the case of Oz, as I said, he was not the first choice for many Republicans in the primary, but ultimately these voters do what we call coming home. That is to say, I don't love my guy, but I hate the other guy, so I guess I'll vote for my guy. They may hold their nose, they may roll their eyes as they vote and say, he wouldn't have been my first choice, but he's better than the other guy, so I'll vote for him. And
Click
I think
the lever.
That's part of what closes it up, the margin.
All right. Late yesterday, it was announced that the President Biden, and Barack Obama will make a visit to Pennsylvania in the next 2 weeks to not endorse, but at least campaign for John Fetterman here. That didn't work out so well in Philadelphia the last time Barack Obama came here right before an election with Hillary Clinton. In fact, it was somewhat of a disaster, I think, that appearance. How do you think that helps or hurts here?
Well, I think you have to target any kind of an appearance like that. You have to target it. You have to bring that person to exactly the right place. And in this case, you could argue, is their time better spent in the Philly suburbs or in the city itself? We know from past elections that a Democrat beating a Republican in the city of Philadelphia is baked in. That's going to be the case no matter who's running.
Check that box, right?
Hillary Clinton destroyed Donald Trump in 2016 in the city of Philadelphia. the end, it didn't matter because that was already assumed. She didn't do well enough in the Philly suburbs and the rural areas around the state, and she ultimately lost the state in a nail biter, but she lost the state. So the question is, do you go into the city and try to make that already large margin even more massive, or do you go out in the suburbs and try to cement a bigger victory there? We know that the collar counties around Philadelphia, Delaware County, Montgomery County, Chester County, Delaware, or Bucks County, have all become more blue over the last number of years. And so there is fertile ground there for Democrats to not only win massively in the city, but win big in those suburban areas. And let's be kind of clear, they need to, because Democrats get blown out throughout much of the rest of the state, at least geographically. You look at a map of Pennsylvania, you're going to see huge swaths of red and a couple of pockets of deep blue. So the question is where you go. Ironically, of course, as you well know, Dave, it's all the same TV market. So that appearance, for most viewers seeing the appearance, it is still, whether they go to somewhere in Chester County or in Center City, Philadelphia, it's all part of the Philadelphia TV market. But I do think you send a message when you go to a specific town in a specific county versus somewhere else, even though on TV, it's just a chyron in the bottom third of the screen that says you were in Malvern instead of South Philly. Sure. You're sending a message in terms of where you go.
Yeah. Let's finish this off real quick. I'll give some props to the moderators who asked the questions in this debate. I thought the questions were good questions. They covered the topics, the issues very well. They had good factual basis in those questions. They had good follow-up questions, and they kept everybody under control fairly well. I don't think anybody was going to get out of control between those two. As you said, Dr. Oz, a polished television person. Mr. Fetterman making his points where he wants to make his points. But I thought they did a very, very good job on that debate. Sometimes debates can be a disaster if the person kind of running the debate doesn't do a very good job.
Couldn't agree more. I thought they did a very good job. The one area that I would fault, and again, this is all negotiated beforehand, and so presumably Fetterman's team signed off on this. I do think the format, sometimes these debates can go as long as 90 minutes. This was a 60-minute debate. And sometimes you can foul things up with the format per se. Giving the candidates a maximum of 60 seconds to answer, 30 seconds for follow-ups, and 15 seconds for some of these rebuttals. Candidly, 15 seconds is almost insultingly foolish. The idea that you're going to get a meaningful point in 15 seconds is absurd. And so what you wind up with, and obviously in this regard, Oz, as the skilled television person, is going to be much better than Fetterman, is you wind up reducing everything to bumper sticker slogans and sound bites, the 15-second sound bite, and it's very tough to get into real meat and potatoes issues. You don't want to get too deep in the woods and bore people. Heaven forbid we do that. But when you're talking about 15 and 30-second little snippets, it's very hard to get meaningful answers from these guys, especially when they want to revisit the last question because the other guy got in a good shot 30 seconds ago, or you want to talk about something that's more in your wheelhouse. So I didn't love the format, and I think it very clearly did no favors for Fetterman. And this is where I fault the Fetterman campaign in particular for agreeing to a format that was almost too fast-paced. I mean, this thing was like a lightning round for 60 straight minutes. So much so, as they say, that you couldn't get too much meat in, but also Oz was talking a mile a minute because he understood he had to get his answer in a short period of time. Simply impossible for Fetterman to do that. So I didn't love the format, but I agree with you. I thought the moderators did a perfectly good job.
And the bell thing to stop them from talking did make them stop in most occasions. I don't like the bell thing, but it worked. Well,
I guess it beats cutting the microphone entirely, or some big air horn, or a hook that pulls the guy off the stage, or something.
Or muting their mic or whatever.
Right. But
okay, Bruce, let's get to a topic I know you're dying to talk about. The whole city of Philadelphia and the entire region is dying to talk about. It's not debates. It's not politics. It's not Fetterman and Oz. It's not any of the other candidates running across the country. Everybody wants to talk about the fabulous Phillies, who did an incredible job this postseason, making it to the World Series, shocked the city, energized the city, made everybody crazy. I got to tell you, an amazing performance by the Phillies and Rob Thompson. You gotta give them their due. The true underdog just barely made it into the playoffs, and look where we are now in Houston, getting ready to open the World Series. Your thoughts?
If you had said to anyone in Philadelphia a month or so ago that we would be here today, they would have told you were absolutely crazy. I looked at the final standings just again yesterday, doing a little bit of just. I love looking this kind of stuff up. The Phillies were 4-6 in their final 10 games.
Right.
And normally, what happens because of the way the baseball playoffs are set up, a division winner, which may be the best team around, and maybe 100-win team, oftentimes kind of coasts to that divisional victory. If they're much better than everybody else in their division, they're going to win, and they kind of coast to victory, and you can lose a little of your edge. More often than not, the wild card scenario produces a situation in which multiple teams are after one or two, or in this year, three positions. This year, really, the last two positions were kind of up for grabs, and there was three teams, Milwaukee involved in there. So normally, under normal circumstances, that wild card team, while they may have a lesser record, they come into the playoffs red hot.
Yeah.
They had to be red hot just to make the playoffs in the first place.
Right.
That was simply not the case this year. The Phillies stumbled and bumbled their way into the playoffs.
Right.
Barely made it.
Held on for dear life.
Right. And only, frankly, because Milwaukee was playing just as poorly as they were. Otherwise, the Brewers would have passed them, and we'd be lamenting another, autumn without playoff baseball. But look, it's one of the reasons why I love sports. It's like going to a Broadway show every night, except that the ending is different every night. The script is completely different every night.
Sure.
Whatever can happen will happen. Guys who were nothing suddenly become stars. Big stars show up small at the wrong time.
Yeah.
There's nothing more exciting. And when this city gets excited about a sports team, there's nothing else like it in the country, frankly.
Yeah, and I got to tell you, you can't, as you just said, it's hard to single out one player and or anybody else in the organization who did a great job on their own. Everybody did a great job. The manager did a great job. Bryce Harper did a great job. Schwarber did a great job. The starting pitching was pretty good. The bullpen was outstanding. A place that was a weakness last year and the beginning of this year turned into be a super strength at the end. Those two guys were closing out games, like Mariano Rivera up in New York. Back when the Yankees were a powerhouse and he came in the ninth inning, you might as well turn the lights out and everybody go home. I mean, they were throwing 98, 102. They were dropping the slider in. They were throwing fastballs on the edge. They did a lot of great things. Almost every player on the team contributed in this run from the wild card games all the way up to where we are right now. Almost everybody contributed.
And I'll tell you this as well. When the last game there against San Diego, when the rain goes from a steady drizzle to a virtual downpour in that bottom of the seventh inning, and Sir Anthony comes in there and simply cannot grip the ball. And obviously it's happened before, but obviously not often, where a runner's at second base and two wild pitches within the same at bat later, he's coming across the plate. And if you wind up losing a game, that game based on two wild pitches in a rainstorm, that is exactly the kind of thing where you say, well, all right, that's one game. They still would have had the next game. They could have. Fine. If they lose that game in that manner, again, I've been around Philadelphia sports enough to know that is exactly the kind of thing that puts the proverbial curse on you and you are done. And so the idea that they could come back and win that kind of a game after falling behind in that bizarre fashion, that sort of classic Philadelphia sports fashion. How'd you lose the game? Well, it was raining and this lights out reliever was throwing fastballs back to the screen because the catcher could barely get a glove on it. That would have been the Phillies of old. But the idea of coming from behind to win that game in particular in the way they won it tells me this may be a team of destiny. It's interesting. I was looking up yesterday, the only time in history, in baseball history, where there has been a greater disparity in the win total between one World Series participant and the other was, and this year it's 19 games, 106 wins for the Astros, 87 wins for the Phillies, so 19 games better were the Astros and the Phillies this year. The only bigger difference in baseball history was in 1906. Chicago White Sox Chicago Cubs. The Cubs win 116 games. The White Sox win 93. So it's a 23-game disparity between the two teams. So who wins the World Series? Of course, the White Sox. The hitless wonders of the White Sox, despite being 23 games behind the Cubs in terms of their record, won the World Series.
Bruce, you're the only one who could find that statistic. I could tell you in the city of Philadelphia, including all the sportscasters.
Well, it's out there floating around in the
I know.
But I'll tell you one other little statistical thing that I do think is kind of interesting. There's only 3 teams now, including this year's Astros team, that swept both their divisional series and their pennant series, like the Astros did. They're 7-0, of course. There's only 2 teams prior that have done that: the 07 Colorado Rockies and the 2014 Kansas City Royals. Both of those teams lost in the World Series. After going into the World Series unbeaten, they both lost. So it is possible. I'm not sure how much money I'd bet on the Phillies, but you can bet I'll be rooting for them the entire way. And I think they have, in boxing terminology, they have what's called a puncher's chance.
Yes.
They can land a blow and you know, who knows? Who knows what happens?
And listen, you can't talk about all this and how great the team did without talking about the fans. I talked to folks who were in the stadium in 2008, and I'll talk about where you and I were in 2008 in a little bit because there's some fond memories there. But that crowd was primed from 2 hours before the game all the way through the end of the games. I mean, it was nuts. People were going crazy. People who are veteran Phillies ticket holders were telling me they've never felt that much energy. Always energy, but not that much energy for such a consistent period of time than during these 3 games at home.
And look, the Phillies fans are not, and look, you can say this about most cities, quite frankly.
Yeah.
Phillies fans aren't stupid, and they're not made of money. And so for stretches during this season, when the Phillies were not playing well, the crowds were frankly pretty mediocre. But hey, that's what happens when you're playing mediocre baseball. The crowds don't show up. You know, I made the reference earlier to a Broadway show. If the reviews on the Broadway show that you're thinking about going to are lousy, you may not go. You may not spend your money. That's just perfectly logical, right? That's how our economy works. You don't pay for a bad product. So for a good long stretch this year, the Phillies were a bad product, and the fact is the fans were not coming out. Give them a good product, give them something worth watching, and they will come out in massive numbers, and they will be loud, and they will be obnoxious in a good way. They will be obnoxious in the kind of way that makes it fun for the home team and a nightmare for the opposing team. And there's no better place. You hear this over and over, and I know you've heard this from talking to athletes over the years. There's no better place to play when you're playing well, and no worse place to play when you're playing poorly. They expect a certain level of effort and performance, and when you give it, boy, they are on your side, and they are like a 10th player out there on the field.
Yeah, let me talk about a quality moment I saw on TV last night, and it's Bryce Harper 2 days after winning a World Series, 3 days after winning a World Series, shopping in Trader Joe's in Cherry Hill last night, and or the night before, and happens upon a young lady who lives in the area who's shopping at Trader Joe's for the first time, turns the aisle and walks right up into Bryce Harper and I believe one of his children shopping. And of course, true Phillies fan, stops Bryce Harper and asks for a couple of pictures. He took 2 or 3. And I got to tell you, it's just the guy has captured this town after a rough start and some moments in the seasons he's been here that, you know, haven't been the greatest moments. He's fought through injury. He's won an MVP. He just won the series MVP. But a cool moment in a local supermarket a day before he's going to be in Houston getting ready for the World Series, and he handled it so perfectly. It was incredible, and it tells you the kind of guy that Bryce Harper is. He didn't just say, hey, yeah, good to see you. Great, I got to go. I got to pay for my milk and eggs and bread and go home. No, He took a second, stopped in the middle of the store and took some pictures with that young lady, and obviously made her day, her year, her month, probably her life.
And it's interesting that with very few exceptions, this guy has written the book on how to behave as a Philadelphia athlete.
Yes.
Don't make excuses, play hard, understand the mindset of the Phillies fans. And part of that understanding, and look, I went to my first Phillies game in 1967. So I've been following this team for a little bit now. One of the things that's interesting about the Phillies fans is they're a tough bunch. They like promoting that idea of themselves as tough, but they don't like to be criticized.
No.
They're rather thin-skinned in that regard. They do not want to be criticized in any way. Once you understand that, and look, there's some rationale behind that. You know, they want to boo. They've spent their $40 or $50 for a decent ticket to a ball game, and if you stunk that night, they feel like they have a right to boo. And frankly, they do. They don't have a right to throw things or be obscene, but they certainly have a right to boo you. And once you understand that, and once you understand that all they want is your best effort and something to show for that best effort. Your best effort doesn't mean anything if you're hitting 210, but if you perform to your utmost ability and give them that effort for their hard-earned money, because they all know you're making 10, 20, $30 million a year, then you're going to be on great terms with those fans. And he has understood that from the beginning. There's just enough humility there, just enough understanding of what the fans expect. And yes, it's our job to do that. I've often said about athletes that I never subscribe to this idea that, well, they're making all this money to play a kid's game. Well, what they're playing bears no resemblance to the baseball you and I played when we were 15 years old. No resemblance.
No.
So these guys are on another planet with regard to their skill set. Once you understand that, though, I want them to understand that only because they live in the bizarre time and place on this planet that pays massive amounts of money, because you can take a stick and hit a ball that somebody threw and hit it over a wall 350 feet away, that makes you worth millions of dollars. It's a bizarre concept, but it is our society. And so once you understand how fortunate you are to be in that position, then I think you've got that mutual respect. The player doesn't look down on the fans. The fans understand that the player is doing his best and happens to have a unique skill set. All is well. And when it's going well in Philly, there's no better place to be.
Yeah, no doubt about it. A lot of stores, liquor stores, and all kinds are going to be doing really well in the next few days as everybody watches the series. Here's the formula I hope works again. Go steal a game in Houston or two, but steal at least one. Come home, ready to go, beginning of next week. Go all in on that first game like we did on Friday night's game coming back from San Diego. I thought the manager played that so well to go get the most he could out of his starting pitcher and then go all in on the bullpen for the last last three innings. And to give Sir Anthony the ball like that for 2 innings, 6 outs, and then him to say after the game, when he was asked, could you go again tomorrow? And he said, I don't know if I could do 6, but I can do 3, but I'm ready to go. I mean, that formula worked perfect, and big star for Rob Thompson for that strategy. He should use the same damn strategy right here.
It's also interesting because I think that clearly we talk about all the players who are performing well. I got to be honest, right now I've got no confidence whatsoever in David Robertson. Brad Hand, I've got virtually no confidence in. So they've got to kind of pick their spots and use guys where they can be most successful. You mentioned Rob Thompson. Maybe I'm a glass half empty kind of guy, but my mind always goes sort of, when everybody zigs, I tend to zag. Think right now about what must be going through Joe Girardi's mind.
Yeah.
Right? All of this success, all of the accolades for Thompson. And while the players have certainly not, as far as I'm aware, openly been critical of Girardi by name, the old manager was terrible for this. You haven't heard that.
No.
But the high praise for Thompson is in its own way an indictment of Girardi. But let's face it, the narrative here is very simple. Once we got rid of, if you're Joe Girardi, the narrative is once we got rid of you, everything went great and this team got hot and now they're in the World Series. So it couldn't be more clear that the narrative is Joe Girardi was the one to blame for the fact that they were 22-27 at one point, or 22-29 at one point in the regular season. So as good as you probably feel that the team is winning, that the narrative is, whether it's correct or not, doesn't even matter. The narrative is you were the reason they weren't playing well. Once they got rid of you, all is well.
Yeah.
That's got to be a tough pill to swallow for Girardi.
Okay, look, you and I had the privilege of being in this city working on the news in 2008 when they won the last time. I was in a helicopter in center field when Brad Lidge threw that last pitch and they won, and then covered the celebration in Center City from the helicopter for hours on end after that. I have to say,
Safest place to be.
Safest place to be for me. B, it's a close match between them and the Eagles winning and covering the Eagles parade. But I gotta say, sitting in a chopper in center field outside the stadium watching that pandemonium break loose was one of the more thrilling moments of my career, if not the most thrilling in terms of just being juiced up like no tomorrow. The whole city was just like electric for days on end. But walk me through your fondest feeling from that 2008 win there.
Well, what was fun for a couple of reasons. One of the things I remember most, quite frankly, was being asked to co-anchor with our news anchors to provide sort of the color commentary and co-anchoring for the Phillies parade several days later, which was about what's, the usual. Well, it's about 1.5 miles, so that should take about 2 hours. Well, 4.5 hours later, it's still going because
all day,
1/10 of a mile an hour because people won't let them, won't let them move. Yeah. But just being able to experience that, we were set up at the ballpark where the parade was to come to us. Yeah. And just to be part of that experience and be able to kind of narrate as you would see various players talk about their accomplishments. And I'm a big student of baseball history, so to be able to talk about the Phillies' history with regard to the World Series and others, obviously much more misery than triumph over the years for the Phillies. Yeah. But that, of course, makes the triumph that much sweeter. So that was kind of the most fun for me, being part of the parade. A couple of days later, I'm trying to think, it would have been right around Halloween, I guess, that they would have won the thing. And Halloween night, I came home after a long day of doing stuff, and my wife said, some guy from the Phillies came by. And I said, what do you mean some guy from the Phillies came by? And Brett Myers, the pitcher, had apparently brought his kids. Our neighborhood was kind of perfect for Halloween trick-or-treating into the houses, a fair number of homes, close enough to each other. You could bang out, house after house. And I guess he had showed up at the front door with some other kids. We got a lot of imports, kids from other neighborhoods and so forth, because it was a good trick-or-treating neighborhood. And
sure.
She, of course, had no idea who he was, but everybody else was making a big fuss. And I thought, well, that's sort of an interesting way to end things. We got a trick-or-treat visit from a Phillies pitcher. But it was all, as you say, it was just this magical time. And for at least a few days, whether the numbers actually showed it or not, I don't know. But for a while, all the murder and mayhem that sometimes is part of the narrative of the big city seems to go away, or at least not be so front and center in everyone's mind. And for a few days, it actually is the city of brotherly love and sisterly affection, which is wonderful to see. And there's few things that can do that like sports can. I mean, there's not much out there that can change the whole city's mood about it and feeling about itself like sports.
Speaking of cushy jobs, though, while you were sitting on the set talking about the parade and doing all that, I was walking with the parade on Broad Street with the buses, and there's no place else I would have rather have been for that, Bruce. Just like with the Eagles, when they had the Eagles parade, same exact thing. Just to be among the fans and everybody who just wanted to be part of this electric situation. It was an incredible time, magical, as you just said, and I hope we get it again. I really do. I won't be there to cover it this time, but wouldn't that be a cool thing again? To happen twice. To happen twice in your lifetime is an amazing thing. Once is great. Twice would just be super incredible. And I wish the Phillies the best. I know you do too. And I'm kind of hoping the formula works. Take one, maybe two in Houston, come home and sweep them in Philly and get on with it.
I'll tell you what, too, a parade covering obviously an outdoor parade in late October, early November beats the heck out of covering an Eagles parade in middle of February or early February.
Yeah, it was pretty cold.
That is not a pleasant time to be standing outside for.
I think I was 3 layers that day, and it was all day. You talk about all day. I mean, we were still doing live shots at 6:30 that night from 9 a.m. in the morning when the parade kicked off. It was crazy, but you don't mind the cold weather when everybody's so warm and wonderful. During a thing like that. But
when you're having
go
fun,
Phillies.
Right, the weather doesn't matter. Yeah.
No, Bruce, thanks for coming on the show. I greatly appreciate it. I love your expertise on both topics, and it's always fun to talk baseball with Bruce Gordon, one of the more knowledgeable guys, and he threw that little factoid in there about the disparagement between one team and another the difference between one team and another on the wins. Only you could find that fact, Bruce, and that's why I love you.
I'm a lovable guy. That's me.
There you go. Enjoy. Go Phillies and enjoy the series, folks. Bring us home a victory, and we'll see you the next time around. Thanks for listening to the Philly Prime Podcast. Join us next week. We'll talk to you then.